The Pinsker Orphans. The story of the Pinsker Jewish orphans of the 1920s is but a small part of a much larger and forgotten part of Jewish history, the horrors suffered by the Jews in the Pale of Settlement between the two world wars. These horrors have been overshadowed by the Holocaust and suppressed by the Soviets who controlled the area. These horrors commenced in 1914 with World War I and the forced relocation of Jews by the Russians. This was followed by the Spanish influenza epidemic and pogroms committed by advancing and retreating troops. Finally, complete chaos, devastation, crop failure, starvation, and the diseases that accompany hunger and cold added to the extremely harsh living conditions that continued well into the 1920s. Jewish communities around the world were shocked by the news of the horrors of war and the pogroms, starvation and disease suffered by the Jews in the Pale of Settlement. Especially horrific were accounts of wholesale rape, extortion and slaughter of their brethren by Polish, Ukrainian and Belarus nationalistic armies and the red and white Cossack Russian troops. No one knows how many Jews perished in the Pale of Settlement between the two world wars. In January 1921, the then British Chief Rabbi, Dr. Hertz, declared 1 million human beings had been butchered and that for 3 years 3 million persons in the Ukraine had been made to pass through the horrors of hell, and there were some 600,000 homeless children, 150,000 orphans, and 35,000 double orphans in the Ukraine who would die from cold, hunger, or disease unless Jewish hearts remained human and came to their rescue. The Jewish communities around the world heard the cries of their brethren, whom they helped in many ways. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, saved hundreds of thousands from certain starvation with their mass feeding programs, and Jewish communities from Canada, Palestine, and South Africa rescued groups of approximately 200 Jewish orphans each by transporting them to their respective countries and caring for them. Reports of the Red Cross. The reports of investigators of the Red Cross and other relief agencies show that in Poland hardly a child under 5 years old remains alive. There are no able-bodied young men, no strong young women. The old, the maimed, the emaciated children, more than 800,000 of these, are entirely dependent upon America and Canada. At best, these peoples and millions in the other war-stricken countries can be kept from starvation. They can be kept alive until the industries in the nations are resumed, if this appeal is successful. Major H.T. Davis, a member of the Red Cross Commission to Poland, in a letter to Mrs. Davis, describes the conditions as he actually found them in Poland, and this one paragraph from his letter is enough to convince everyone of the urgent need of the appeal in Canada. Thousands and thousands of children, old men and women without clothing, warmth or food, and racked by typhus. In some places half of the population is sick, and other diseases. Wanderers by the thousands trying to return to their homes from which they were driven out by the Russians or Germans. Starving and dying women and children, deliriously crying for bread, huddled together in synagogues, men and women all too weak to stand up or move about, piteously stretching their hands towards you. And those faces, emaciated, thin, burning eyes, listless, unable to appreciate anything you may say to them, only begging for a piece of bread. In the city of Pinsk, I saw hundreds of children, women, and inmates of hospitals who did not have a piece of bread for 4 days, and the bread they are asking for, a filthy mixture of a little flour with bark of trees or leaves, sawdust, and God knows what. What do you think of a diet of wild horse chestnuts for those sick with typhus, or of warm water with a little cornmeal mixed in with it? For God's sake, let us take pity on these unfortunates, says Nathan Strauss, America's foremost philanthropist. The primary purpose of this book is to remember those Pinsker orphans left behind, and includes 135 letters in Hebrew and Yiddish written by them in 1921 to their hero, Alter Bobrow. It is most important to remember these children by publishing their letters, as no one knows how many of them perished in the Holocaust 20 years later. The book contains over 100 letters written to Alter Bobrow by the Pinsker Orphans, who remained behind when he left in July 1921 with the Ochberg Orphans for South Africa. Following is a letter from Cyril Suposnik, dated the 5th of July 1921. Honourable Teacher and Best Headmaster, when you were here with us, we knew we had someone to care for us. But now, when the time has come and you are saying goodbye to all our children, you can imagine, dear Headmaster, how horrible we feel in our heart. We feel even worse than before when we first came to the orphanage. We know well who established the orphanage, first God, then you, together with Mr. Holtzman. It is well known that no one was interested in the fate of the miserable suffering orphans, but God had pity on the poor lonely souls and sent 2 angels from heaven to help the unhappy orphans. It was a terrible time. No person wanted to go out into the street. The frost burnt like fire, the winds were howling, and no one had pity on our orphans. Only 2 men had pity on us. They brought us back to life. The streets were dangerous, bullets were flying overhead, and few people came to the orphanage. But the teachers, Mr. Abroff and Mr. Holtzman, were fearless. They ran around in an effort to bring something to put in the mouths of the unhappy orphans in order to save them from hunger and keep their poor souls alive. We are deeply grateful for everything you have done for us. We wish you a good trip and everything you wish for yourself. Before we were taken into the orphanage, we were swimming in deep water with no shore in sight. No one had pity on us, only 2 men, Mr. Abroff and Mr. Holtzman, and saved us from death. And now the day has come when we have to say goodbye. You can quite well imagine how terrible we feel. If we had a problem, we came for advice to our best friend. But now that you depart, we feel so terribly sad and so bitter. We trust that when you arrive safely at your destination, you will plead for us. We wish you a good trip and arrive safely in good health. Alter Bobrow, as a young man, helped save the children, and he, together with his comrades, looked after them and helped establish the 3 orphanages in Pinsk in 1917. In 1921, Alter accompanied Isaac Ochberg with the 181 Ochberg Orphans, selected from orphanages in the Pale, including 44 from the Pinsk orphanages, to South Africa. As the Ochberg Orphans book, published in 2011, includes the full histories of 30 of the 44 Pinsker orphans that went to South Africa with Isaac Ochberg and Alter Bobrow in 1921, this book only tells their story in brief. This book includes the great work done by the Pinsker Orphans Relief Fund of London that supported the Pinsker orphanages and that brought out to London for adoption a group of 19 children in 1924 and a further group of 34 in 1926. It also tells the life stories of some of these rescued children and of some of the committee members who supported this fund. Lastly, the book tells of the great work of the JDC, who not only supported the Pinsk Jewish community, including the 3 Pinsker orphanages, but who supported many hundreds of Jewish communities throughout the Pale of Settlement with their orphanages, hospitals, schools, old age homes, soup kitchens, feeding programs, and agricultural development and other programs. The Pinsker Orphans follows on from the Ochberg Orphans and expands upon the section Alter Bobrow and the three Pinsk Orphanages in that book. The Ochberg Orphans and the Horrors from Whence They Came, published in 2011, details these horrors of the Pale of Settlement 1914 to 1922 and the help given by Jewish communities around the world. It includes the life story of Isaac Ochberg and those of 130 of the 181 Ochberg Orphans, Ukraine War and Pogrom Orphans, and the history of the South African Jewish Orphanage and Cape Jewish Orphanages, later known as Arcadia and Oranjia respectively. The Ochberg Orphans volume is preceded by two Arcadia, also known as ARC, memory volumes. The first volume, published in 2006, 100 Years of ARC Memories, celebrated the centenary of Arcadia, previously the South African Jewish Orphanage, and contained the memories of over 120 of its children. The second volume, More ARC Memories, published in 2008, contains the memories of over 100 further children, including a section of 17 chapters on Ochberg's orphans.
The book has four aims: to record the forgotten history, the horrors suffered by the Jews in the Pale of Settlement in between the world wars, and the help given to them by their brethren, the Jewish communities worldwide; to provide a legacy for the descendants of each Pinsker orphan, a book which gives the history of the Pinsker orphanages and preserves the life story of their Pinsker orphan relative; to remember all the children left behind, most of whom would have perished in the Holocaust; to raise funds for Arcadia and Oranjia, both the two Jewish orphanages in South Africa which still exist, and also for the JDC. All the proceeds from the sale of this volume and the three previous volumes will be donated to these three institutions which take care of children in need. I feel honored to be the compiler of this volume and the catalyst for its creation, and regard these 4 volumes of life stories collected as the property of the Jewish community. I thank all the many people who helped me collect the life stories, and those who have opened their hearts and shared their parents' stories. I dedicate the book to the Pinsker Orphans, the Ochberg Orphans, and the deceased Arcadians, and to the generosity of the South African Jewish community, which has always taken care of its own. In these difficult times in South Africa, I appeal to all ex-South Africans to support their needy community left behind by supporting the Hebrew Kadisha. I end with a blessing that Dr. Lichtenfeld, Arcadia superintendent from 1952 to 1971, often bestowed on the congregation at Arcadia. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious unto you, and give you peace and happiness. And may there be peace in Israel soon. Thank you, David. I appeal to South Africans and ex-South Africans to share their Litvak family histories for a new proposed volume that will tell of our immigration to South Africa from, say, 1880 to 1940. The family history should include what the family, our ancestors, did and where they lived in Lithuania and Latvia, the journey to South Africa, and where they settled and what they did in their early years in South Africa. And also photos. I'm interested mainly in the older history, with a very brief summary of the family's current history and whereabouts. Copies of old family histories and booklets will be most welcome. My contact details are David Sandler, sedsand at iinet.net.au. I repeat that, sedsand, that's sedsand at iinet.net.au. Thank you and best wishes, David.